The bustling downtown restaurant was alive with the typical lunch rush energy. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the soft clink of expensive silverware filled the air. At one of the corner tables sat Mrs. Richardson, draped in designer clothes and dripping with jewelry that could have paid someone's yearly salary. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently on the white tablecloth as she waited for her order. The young waitress approached the table, carrying a tray with practiced ease. Her name tag read Michelle, and despite working a double shift, her warm smile never wavered. She'd been working at the Golden Fork for 3 years now, juggling the job with her nursing studies. The tips from this upscale establishment helped pay for her textbooks and her grandmother's medication. "Here's your Caesar salad with the dressing on the side, ma'am," Michelle said, carefully placing the plate in front of Mrs. Richardson. The wealthy woman's nose wrinkled immediately, and she pushed the plate away with one finger as if it were contaminated. "I specifically asked for the romaine to be cut into 1-inch pieces," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Did you not understand such simple instructions? Or is that too complicated for someone of your background?" Michelle's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. I'll have the kitchen prepare a new salad right away." "Well, should hope so," Mrs. Richardson sneered, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Though I suppose I shouldn't expect too much. People like you probably don't even know what proper dining looks like. I bet you've never even eaten at a place like this." Unknown to Mrs. Richardson, at a nearby table sat Dr. James Chen, the hospital's chief of surgery. He'd been quietly observing the interaction while having lunch with his colleagues. Dr. Chen had interviewed Michelle just last week for the hospital's competitive nursing program scholarship, and her dedication and compassion had left a lasting impression. As Michelle turned to head back to the kitchen, Mrs. Richardson's voice cut through the air again. "And while you're at it, perhaps you could send over a server who actually knows what they're doing? Someone more suitable for this establishment?" Several diners nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michelle's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the rejected plate, but she held her head high. She'd faced similar treatment before, but it never got easier. Still, she thought of her grandmother's proud face when she'd show her the nursing degree one day. That thought alone gave her the strength to maintain her dignity. Dr. Chen watched as Michelle handled the situation with remarkable grace. He'd seen that same quiet strength during her interview when she spoke about overcoming obstacles to pursue her dreams of becoming a nurse. He remembered how she'd mentioned working double shifts to support her grandmother, who'd raised her single-handedly. The restaurant manager, having overheard the commotion, approached Mrs. Richardson's table. "Is everything all right here, ma'am?" "No, everything is not all right," Mrs. Richardson replied, her voice rising. "The service here has gone downhill. When did this place start hiring just anybody off the street? In my day, there were standards." As Mrs. Richardson continued her tirade, Michelle returned with a fresh salad, prepared exactly to specifications. She placed it down with the same gentle care as before, even as Mrs. Richardson pointedly turned away from her. "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" Michelle asked, her voice steady despite the humiliation she'd endured. "Just try not to mess up anything else," Mrs. Richardson replied dismissively, waving her hand as if shooing away a fly. Dr. Chen had seen enough. He quietly signaled for his check, his mind already formulating a plan. Sometimes, he thought, the most important lessons in life come from unexpected places, and Mrs. Richardson was about to receive one she wouldn't soon forget. The tension in the restaurant remained palpable as Michelle continued her shift, serving other tables with the same warmth and professionalism she'd shown from the start. Some regular customers, who'd witnessed the scene, left her larger tips than usual, along with kind words of encouragement. But none of them knew that this afternoon would mark a turning point in Michelle's life, thanks to a silent observer who recognized true character when he saw it. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Richardson strode into St. Hope Memorial Hospital, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. She'd scheduled a private consultation about her daughter's upcoming cosmetic surgery, confident that her family name and generous donations would secure the best surgeon in the city. The hospital's prestigious reputation and exclusive clientele made it her first choice. At the reception desk, she announced her arrival with the same air of superiority she carried everywhere. "I have an appointment with the chief of surgery," she declared, not bothering to look up from her phone. "Mrs. Richardson for Dr. Chen." The receptionist directed her to the third floor, where she was led into a well-appointed office. The walls were lined with medical degrees and humanitarian awards. Mrs. Richardson barely glanced at them, too busy typing on her phone to notice the accomplishments displayed around her. When Dr. Chen entered the room, she finally looked up, expecting to see someone suitably impressed by her presence. Instead, she found herself face to face with the same man who'd been sitting in the restaurant during her lunch 2 weeks ago. His expression was professional but carried a weight that made her slightly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Richardson," he greeted her, his voice calm and measured. "Before we discuss your daughter's procedure, I'd like to share something with you." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Could you please send in our new scholarship recipient?" Mrs. Richardson shifted impatiently in her seat. "I don't see how this is relevant to my daughter's surgery," she complained, but Dr. Chen merely smiled politely and gestured toward the door. The door opened, and Michelle walked in, wearing a crisp white coat with a hospital ID badge. Mrs. Richardson's face drained of color as recognition dawned. The young woman she'd humiliated at the restaurant now stood before her, poised and professional. "Mrs. Richardson, I'd like you to meet Michelle Thompson, the recipient of our hospital's full nursing scholarship," Dr. Chen announced. She was selected from hundreds of applicants for her exceptional compassion, resilience, and dedication to patient care. The same qualities I witnessed firsthand at the Golden Fork. Michelle's expression remained composed, showing no sign of the hurt Mrs. Richardson had inflicted that day. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her new white coat a symbol of her perseverance and dreams. "Michelle will be starting her clinical rotations next month," Dr. Chen continued, "and given her outstanding qualifications, she'll be working closely with our surgical team. In fact, she'll be assisting during your daughter's procedure." Mrs. Richardson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization that the young woman she dismissed as beneath her would now be involved in her daughter's care struck her like a physical blow. I think there must be some mistake," Mrs. Richardson stammered, her usual arrogance crumbling. "Perhaps we should discuss other options." "Mrs. Richardson," Dr. Chen interjected firmly, "in this hospital, we value character above all else. Michelle has demonstrated exceptional patient care skills, even in the face of challenging situations. I witnessed firsthand how she handled herself with grace and professionalism during your interaction at the restaurant." Michelle finally spoke, her voice gentle but confident. "Mrs. Richardson, I want to assure you that every patient receives the highest standard of care from our team, regardless of their background or previous interactions. Your daughter will be in excellent hands." The wealthy woman's face flushed with shame as she remembered her cruel words. The young woman she'd tried to humiliate was now speaking to her with more dignity and professionalism than she'd shown that day at the restaurant. Dr. Chen continued, "In healthcare, Mrs. Richardson, we see people at their most vulnerable. We treat everyone, from CEOs to janitors, with the same respect and care. It's a lesson some learn early, others later, but it's one we all must learn." Mrs. Richardson stared at her expensive handbag, unable to meet either of their eyes. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her daughter's surgery suddenly seemed less important than the harsh truth she was facing about herself. I owe you an apology," she finally managed to say to Michelle, her voice barely above a whisper. "My behavior was inexcusable." Michelle's response was immediate and sincere. Thank you, Mrs. Richardson. I accept your apology. Now, shall we discuss how we can provide the best care for your daughter? The next hour was spent reviewing the surgical procedure, with Michelle displaying an impressive knowledge of the process. Mrs. Richardson found herself listening intently, seeing the young woman in a completely new light. Each time Michelle spoke, the memory of her own prejudiced behavior became more uncomfortable. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Richardson lingered behind after Michelle left the office. Dr. Chen, she said, her voice heavy with emotion, I've learned a valuable lesson today. One I won't forget. Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn, Dr. Chen replied. The question is whether we're humble enough to accept these lessons when they come. Walking out of the hospital that day, Mrs. Richardson felt fundamentally changed. The designer clothes and expensive jewelry suddenly felt less like symbols of superiority and more like shallow attempts to elevate herself above others. She thought about how many other talented, hardworking people she might have dismissed or treated poorly because of her prejudices. The day of her daughter's surgery arrived, and Mrs. Richardson sat nervously in the waiting room. The pristine hospital walls seemed to echo with her thoughts as she remembered her first encounter with Michelle. Her daughter, Lily, had noticed her mother's unusual quietness over the past few weeks but hadn't understood the reason behind the change. "Mom, are you okay?" Lily asked, squeezing her mother's hand. "You've been different since that hospital consultation." Mrs. Richardson managed a small smile. "I'm fine, dear. I've just been doing a lot of thinking lately." She hadn't told her daughter about the incident at the restaurant or her subsequent encounter with Michelle. The shame of having her daughter know about her behavior was too much to bear. Michelle entered the waiting room, her white coat crisp and professional. "Good morning, Mrs. Richardson, Lily," she greeted them warmly. "We're ready to begin the pre-op procedures." As Michelle began explaining the process to Lily, Mrs. Richardson watched in amazement. The young woman's knowledge and bedside manner were impeccable. Lily, who was usually anxious about medical procedures, found herself relaxing as Michelle explained everything in clear, caring terms. "You're in good hands, Lily," Michelle assured her with a gentle smile. "Dr. Chen is one of the best surgeons in the country, and our entire team will take excellent care of you." As they wheeled Lily toward the operating room, Mrs. Richardson found herself reaching for Michelle's arm. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning far more than just the care for her daughter. During the surgery, Mrs. Richardson couldn't help but think about her life and the way she'd treated people. She remembered the countless times she'd looked down on service workers, housekeepers, and others she'd deemed beneath her social status. The memory of her behavior at the Golden Fork kept replaying in her mind, but now with the sharp sting of regret. Hours later, Michelle came to inform her that the surgery had been successful. "Lily did wonderfully," she said. "She's in recovery now. Would you like to see her?" Walking to the recovery room, Mrs. Richardson noticed how other hospital staff greeted Michelle with genuine warmth and respect. A janitor waved hello, and Michelle stopped briefly to ask about his daughter's college applications. An elderly patient called out to her, and Michelle took a moment to adjust their pillow and share a kind word. In Lily's room, Mrs. Richardson watched as Michelle checked vitals and ensured her daughter's comfort with gentle efficiency. When Lily groggily opened her eyes, Michelle was there with a reassuring smile and soothing words. "Your friend from the restaurant was right about you," a voice said from the doorway. Mrs. Richardson turned to see one of her regular lunch companions from the Golden Fork, Mrs. Thompson, who was visiting another patient. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Richardson asked, feeling her face flush. "After you left that day, she defended you to other customers who were angry about how you treated her. Said everyone has bad days and deserves a chance to be better. That young woman has more class than most people I know." The words hit Mrs. Richardson hard. She excused herself and found a quiet corner in the hospital chapel. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she thought about how Michelle had shown her kindness she hadn't deserved. Later that evening, as Lily rested, Mrs. Richardson made her way to the nurse's station where Michelle was updating patient charts. "May I speak with you for a moment?" she asked quietly. Michelle nodded and led her to a small consultation room. "I need you to know something," Mrs. Richardson began, her voice trembling. "The way I treated you at the restaurant, that wasn't just a bad day. That was who I was. I've spent my life judging people based on things that don't matter, thinking my money and social status made me better than others." Michelle listened quietly, her expression compassionate. "But watching you these past few weeks, your professionalism, your kindness to everyone, regardless of their position, you've taught me more about class and dignity than all my years in high society." Mrs. Richardson wiped away a tear. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've changed me." Michelle's response was thoughtful. "Mrs. Richardson, my grandmother always told me that true growth starts when we can look at ourselves honestly. It takes courage to acknowledge our mistakes and even more to change because of them." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Mrs. Richardson replied softly. "She is. She raised me alone while working 2 jobs. She taught me that our circumstances don't define us, our actions and treatment of others do." Michelle paused. "Would you like to know why I chose nursing?" Mrs. Richardson nodded. "When I was 12, my grandmother got very sick. We couldn't afford good healthcare, but there was this one nurse who treated us with such dignity and compassion. She made us feel like we mattered, regardless of our financial situation. That's when I knew I wanted to do the same for others." Mrs. Richardson thought about her own daughter, sleeping peacefully down the hall, receiving excellent care regardless of the previous history between them. "You've succeeded," she said quietly. "You've more than succeeded." A month after Lily's surgery, the Golden Fork was buzzing with its usual lunchtime crowd. The hostess did a double take when Mrs. Richardson walked in, not because of her presence, but because of her companion, an elderly woman in a wheelchair whom Michelle had often spoken about, her grandmother. "Table for 3, please," Mrs. Richardson requested politely. "We're waiting for Michelle to join us on her lunch break." As they were seated, Mrs. Richardson noticed the surprised looks from the regular patrons who remembered her previous behavior. The same waitress who had taken over Michelle's section after the incident approached their table cautiously. "Welcome to the Golden Fork," she said, trying to hide her uncertainty. "Can I start you with some drinks?" "Yes, thank you," Mrs. Richardson replied with genuine warmth. "And Jessica," she read the waitress's name tag, "I owe you an apology as well. My behavior that day affected everyone working here, and I'm truly sorry." Jessica's shoulders relaxed visibly. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." Michelle's grandmother, Mrs. Davis, observed the interaction with knowing eyes. "You know," she said after Jessica left, "when Michelle told me you'd invited us to lunch, I was skeptical. But I can see the change in you is genuine." Mrs. Richardson folded her hands on the table. "Your granddaughter taught me more than she realizes. Not just about humility, but about true strength." The restaurant manager, who had witnessed the previous incident, approached their table. "Mrs. Richardson, it's good to see you again. Michelle has been an inspiration to our entire staff." "She certainly has," Mrs. Richardson agreed. "Which reminds me, I'd like to discuss something with you about the educational support program I'm establishing for your staff." Michelle arrived shortly after, still in her hospital scrubs, having just finished her morning shift. Her face lit up seeing her grandmother in animated conversation with Mrs. Richardson. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting," Michelle said, taking her seat. "Not at all, dear," Mrs. Richardson replied. "I was just telling your grandmother about the scholarship foundation I'm setting up. The Richardson Davis Educational Fund, if you both approve of the name, of course." Michelle and her grandmother exchanged surprised looks. "After everything I learned from you, Michelle, I realized I had the means to make a real difference." The foundation will provide educational scholarships to service industry workers pursuing healthcare careers. Your story showed me how many talented people just need an opportunity. Mrs. Davis reached across the table and squeezed Mrs. Richardson's hand. "You're doing a beautiful thing," she said softly. "I'm just following the example your granddaughter set," Mrs. Richardson replied. "Oh, and there's something else. Dr. Chen has agreed to be on the foundation's board of directors." As they enjoyed their lunch, Mrs. Richardson noticed how different the restaurant felt when you treated people with respect. The staff were more relaxed, the conversations more genuine. She watched as Michelle greeted her former co-workers with hugs, asking about their families and dreams. "You know what's funny?" Michelle said, between bites of her salad. "Some of my hospital colleagues don't understand why I still come here for lunch. They think I should want to forget this place." "But you can't forget where you came from," her grandmother added. "Exactly," Michelle nodded. "Every time I come here, I remember what it taught me about perseverance, about treating people with dignity no matter how they treat you." Mrs. Richardson felt tears welling up again. "You're going to make an exceptional nurse, Michelle. In fact..." She hesitated, then continued, "I was wondering if you'd consider being a mentor for our scholarship recipients?" Michelle's face brightened. "I'd be honored. Every person deserves someone who believes in them." As their lunch continued, other diners stopped by their table. Regular customers who had witnessed the incident months ago expressed their admiration for both women, Michelle for her grace under pressure, and Mrs. Richardson for her willingness to change and make amends. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, approached their table near the end of their meal. "Michelle, Mrs. Richardson, I hope you don't mind, but I've been thinking. Your story, it's inspired our entire staff. Would you object to us creating a permanent scholarship in Michelle's name? The restaurant would match the contributions from your foundation." Mrs. Richardson looked at Michelle, who was trying to hold back tears. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mrs. Richardson said. "Success shouldn't depend on someone happening to witness an incident of discrimination. It should be available to anyone willing to work for it." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Davis pulled Mrs. Richardson aside. "You know, when Michelle first told me about what happened that day, I was angry," she admitted. "But seeing you now, watching how you're using your influence to create opportunities for others, that's what real change looks like." 1 year later, the Golden Fork was transformed for a special evening event. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above tables adorned with fresh flowers, but tonight's gathering wasn't about fine dining, it was about celebrating dreams. The restaurant had closed early to host the first annual Richardson Davis Educational Fund Awards ceremony. The usual dining area had been converted into an event space, with a small stage at one end. Current and former staff members mingled with hospital personnel, community leaders, and the first group of scholarship recipients. Mrs. Richardson stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. Her daughter Lily sat in the front row, alongside Michelle and her grandmother. Dr. Chen was there too, having become a devoted mentor to many of the aspiring healthcare professionals. "A year ago," Mrs. Richardson began, her voice clear and emotional, "I sat in this very restaurant and showed the worst of who I was. I looked at a young woman and saw only what my prejudices allowed me to see. I was wrong, terribly wrong." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformations. Michelle Thompson didn't just show me my mistakes, she showed me a better way forward. Her grace under pressure, her dedication to helping others despite how they treat her, and her unwavering commitment to her dreams, these became the foundation for what we're celebrating tonight." In the audience, several of the current restaurant staff wiped away tears. They remembered both the incident and the changes that followed. The restaurant had become known not just for its fine dining, but for its commitment to its employees' dreams. "Tonight, we're awarding 15 scholarships to individuals pursuing careers in healthcare," Mrs. Richardson continued. Each recipient has shown the same qualities that Michelle demonstrated: resilience, compassion, and an unwavering dedication to serving others. One by one, the scholarship recipients came forward. There was Jessica, the waitress who had taken over Michelle's section, now starting her journey toward becoming a physical therapist. The dishwasher who dreamed of becoming a radiologist. The hostess pursuing a degree in occupational therapy. When it was Michelle's turn to speak, she received a standing ovation. Now in her final year of nursing school, she had become a symbol of hope for many. Looking around this room, Michelle began, I see more than just scholarship recipients. I see dreams that refuse to be denied. When I was working here, carrying plates and hoping for tips that would help pay for my textbooks, I never imagined that my story would inspire something like this. She looked at her grandmother, who was beaming with pride. My grandmother taught me that education is the key that opens doors, but character is what keeps them open. To all the recipients tonight, remember that your current circumstances don't define your future. They're just the beginning of your story. Dr. Chen took the stage next, announcing a new partnership between the hospital and the foundation. Starting next year, all scholarship recipients will have guaranteed internship positions at St. Hope Memorial. Your dreams don't end with education, they continue with opportunity. The evening continued with stories of hope and transformation. The restaurant owner spoke about how the incident had changed the workplace culture. Customers now asked about the staff's educational pursuits, often leaving encouraging notes with their tips. Some regular patrons had even contributed to the scholarship fund. Mrs. Davis, Michelle's grandmother, shared her perspective as well. When I was raising Michelle, I always told her that education could take her places that I never got to go. But watching this room tonight, I realize she's helping to take others' places too. Near the end of the evening, Mrs. Richardson made one final announcement. The foundation isn't just about providing financial support. We're creating a mentorship network. Each recipient will be paired with a professional in their chosen field. And I'm proud to announce that Michelle has agreed to lead this program. The applause was thunderous. Michelle hugged her grandmother, both of them crying happy tears. Lily, who had become close friends with Michelle during her recovery, cheered loudly from her seat. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Richardson found herself standing in the exact spot where she had once displayed such cruelty. Now, she watched as scholarship recipients took photos with their families, their faces bright with hope and possibility. You know what the best part of all this is? Michelle said, joining her at the spot. It's not just about the scholarships. It's about showing people that change is possible, both in ourselves and in our community. Mrs. Richardson nodded, thinking about her own journey. I learned that true class has nothing to do with money or status. It's about how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. The event ended with a group photo, scholarship recipients, mentors, restaurant staff, and hospital personnel all standing together. It was a picture of what was possible when prejudice was replaced with understanding, when mistakes led to growth instead of shame. As the last guests left, Michelle's grandmother wheeled herself over to Mrs. Richardson. You did good, she said simply, patting her hand. You turned a moment of darkness into a light that will shine for years to come. Looking around the empty restaurant, Mrs. Richardson realized that the Golden Fork had become more than just an upscale dining establishment. It had become a symbol of transformation, a place where dreams were now served alongside fine cuisine, and where the true meaning of class and dignity was demonstrated every day. The story of the rich woman who mocked a black waitress didn't end with an apology. It ended with a revolution of hearts, a cascade of opportunities, and the proof that sometimes, the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most beautiful changes, if we're brave enough to learn, humble enough to change, and determined enough to make a difference.